Hey all, so in this video, we're going to look at D4.2, which is related to stability and change. And we're going to be looking at the theme continuity and change related to ecosystem stability and change. This is in pages 757 to 776. And the questions we're thinking about is what features of ecosystems allow stability over unlimited periods of time? And then what changes caused by humans threaten the stability of ecosystems? So ecosystem stability is only stable if it can persist indefinitely due to processes occurring within the system. So an example of this would be Daintree, which is in Northern Australia, and it's been around for approximately 180 million years. There are species in Daintree of trees that evolved before flowering plants. And it is one of the only places on the planet that we can see species of plants that are mostly only found in the fossil record. Then you have the Borneo lowland rainforest, which is 130 million years old, but the Borneo lowland rainforest has lost a lot of biomass in the last couple of decades due to logging. And then the Namib Desert, which is estimated to be 55 to 80 million years old. And so this is a very rugged ecosystem, but has persisted for a long, long period of time in a very similar capacity. So in order for an ecosystem to be stable, it needs to have a steady energy supply. It needs to have its nutrient cycle contained. So this can be affected by erosion or harvesting or eutrophication. We'll talk more about what eutrophication is, but meaning if there's too many nutrients coming in or somehow the nutrients are leaving this ecosystem, that is going to cause it to become unstable. It needs to have a high genetic diversity of species, especially keystone species. So that's why this otter is here. A keystone species disproportionately supports the health and functionality of an ecosystem. Otters do this by eating urchins, and urchins, if they are too many in number, will eat the roots of the kelp that are the forest that the otters live in. And as a byproduct of that, fish that also live in those kelp forests don't have anywhere to hide from larger predators. So otters are a keystone species in that ecosystem because they make sure that the kelp forest stays healthy and functional. So keystone species are also corals. So corals do not play their role as a keystone species by being a predator, but sometimes keystone species are predators. So wolves or otters are also keystone species. But if you have a high amount of individuals being taken out of your ecosystem by harvesting or poaching, then that's going to cause a problem with your genetic diversity, and you're going to end up with inbreeding depression, where the survivability of your offspring is going to become decreased because they're too genetically similar. And so a reduction in biodiversity, whether it's genetic or species diversity, is going to reduce the resilience of your ecosystem. So rainforest, a tipping point is where a change happens in an ecosystem that is irreversible, or it's going to take a very long time to reverse. And so rainforest tipping point, right now, scientists are concerned that rainforests, which have a lot of rainfall and that allows them to have high biodiversity, with increased logging, there's less transpiration happening from the trees. And as a byproduct, there's less rainfall, which then means there is less rain for the trees to use to grow. And that could mean that rainforests like the Amazon would slowly transition to a grassland area. And so that ecological threshold would be reached and it would be difficult to reverse. And then the transition to a grassland would happen very quickly. So with those drier conditions, there could also be more forest fires, which would then mean also less trees and less transpiration. Mesocosms are where we can take plants and put them in glass bottles, or we can use aquariums with aquatic organisms to model sustainable ecosystems. And if you have a look in the classroom, you'll notice up by the windowsill that there's a variety of plants that are in bottles on the window ledge. And some of them have been there for years. They haven't been watered. They're just in those plastic bottles. And so those are examples of very simple mesocosms. But what scientists can do is they can set up contained systems to see how different effects, what effects different situations have on the stability. I don't know why I was blanking on that word. I was thinking sustainability, but the stability of the ecosystem. So here's sustainability. Okay, so sustainability is the ability to harvest resources in a way that allows harvesting to continue indefinitely. So nutrients, in order for things to be sustainable, are we able to cycle the nutrients that are being produced in that ecosystem? So are decomposers working to cycle those nutrients back into the food system? Is it possible to detoxify waste products? So can waste be utilized by other species in the ecosystem? And then is energy available? So do those organisms have access to sunlight if they're plants, or other food sources if they are heterotrophs? So those factors are going to be really important to maintain a sustainable ecosystem that you can harvest from. And if you need to harvest, in order to have a maximum sustainable yield, which means it's going to continue producing, you need to leave some individuals to reproduce. So for example, Brazil nuts, as the forest is getting cut down in Brazil, many people harvest Brazil nuts from Brazil nut trees just as they fall to the ground. But if the Brazil nut tree is cut away and all of the nuts get harvested, then there's no way for the trees to grow back. So that would be an unsustainable situation. In Canada, in Newfoundland, which is on the east coast of Canada, cod fisheries, there used to be so much cod, which is a type of fish, on the east coast of Canada in the early 1900s, that they said that the fish would leap out of the water straight into your boat. And they were massively overfished. And that cod fisheries industry completely collapsed. So in order to be able to estimate how much cod or other fish can we take out of an ecosystem, we need to be able to get a solid measurement of how many fish are in existence, and potentially what ages are these fish, and are they male or female fish? This is going to be done by Lincoln capture, mark, release, recapture over a variety of areas. And in order for us to be able to have a maximum sustainable yield, we need to think about how many are we going to take out while still allowing that population to reproduce. So in the North Sea, which was more around Iceland, they set quotas. So instead of this whole cod fishery collapse thing that happened in Canada, Iceland and Norway set quotas. They made big holes in the nets so that smaller fish could get out of the nets healthily without getting ripped to pieces or getting trapped in the nets. They made exclusion zones, which were not allowed to be fished, and they reduced their fishing fleet size so that the cod in those areas could sustainably reproduce itself and still be somewhat harvested. And as a byproduct of that, the North Sea has a sustainable cod fishery, unlike Canada, which still does not. So factors that do have to come into play when you're setting quotas for maximum sustainable yield is also factors that are not just related to the population of the organism. So is there a potential for a disease? Could warming oceans affect population reproduction? Could warming oceans cause there to be different kinds of health ramifications for these organisms? And so optimally, you don't want to be taking out the maximum sustainable yield. You want to be more down around the optimal sustainable yield, which gives a little bit of a buffer zone in case there are problems. You're not taking out too much of the population when it will negatively affect its sustainability. So sustainable agriculture, how do we make that happen? In order for sustainable agriculture to be effective, we need healthy soil with healthy bacteria. And healthy soil will store carbon dioxide, and it will help us to grow food. High intensity cropping is not sustainable for a variety of reasons. Number one, tillage. So that means plowing your soil. Plowing soil causes it to dry out. If it dries out, then the bacteria die. Additionally, if it dries out, it will blow away in the wind and it will take all of the nutrients with it. So soils that exist in rainforests are particularly predisposed to this because they're quite thin soils. And as a byproduct, that's because decomposition happens very, very quickly in rainforests. So not a lot of soil mass builds up over time. Most of the nutrients in a rainforest actually exist within the trees themselves. So if you cut out trees from a rainforest, you're taking all those nutrients away, and they have no way to cycle back into the ecosystem. But no-till growing is the first thing that's super important in order to maintain soil health. Then nutrient depletion. If you're growing the same crops over and over and over again, they need the same nutrients. And if you don't rotate your crops, you don't put in nitrogen fixing plants that return nitrogen to the soil, you're going to have to use fertilizers. Fertilizers that use nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, NPK. And if you use too much of them, fertilizers, what can happen is it can run off from the surface of your soil, and those fertilizers get into a body of water. Algae is a plant. NPK helps plants grow. So what ends up happening is the algae starts growing and growing and growing, but it slowly sinks. As it sinks, it loses access to sunlight and starts to die. Then bacteria start to decompose it, and that decomposition process is going to cause carbon dioxide to form. And it is going to remove oxygen from the water because the bacteria is using that oxygen to respire. As the oxygen levels decrease, bigger organisms like fish will then die. Additionally, a lot of this algae has neurotoxins in it, so like blue-green algae in the Baltic Sea. So it can actively kill organisms as well. So having too much fertilizer is going to be a problem. Having too little is going to be equally a problem. Further, monocropping, which means growing only the same crop. So only corn, only wheat. These are problems as well, because if you are an insect that likes corn, let's say, and you find a field of all corn, you're going to call all your insect friends over to be like, oh my God, we've died and gone to corn heaven. And so then you have a huge problem with pest infestations. So you'll need pesticides and potentially herbicides, which kill weeds. But both pesticides and herbicides dramatically negatively impact the healthy bacteria that lives in the soil that helps plants to grow effectively. Lastly, the energy inputs of high intensity cropping is super problematic as well. So harvesting uses fossil fuels. You're using tractors to plow, you're using tractors to harvest. Additionally, if you're growing in greenhouses, you need to heat using fossil fuels potentially. You need to use fossil fuels to make and apply fertilizers, pesticides, or herbicides. All of these require energy, which is problematic. I am not saying that current agricultural practices are entirely problematic. The world since World War II has created huge, huge advances in producing massive amounts of food. But we also have to consider, how are we maintaining the health of our soils and how are we maintaining the health of our water while doing this process. So when we are thinking about contaminants getting into an ecosystem, like we were just looking at with eutrophication, this can also happen outside of water bodies, but also in water bodies. So this process would be called bioaccumulation. So organisms are going to take in chemical contaminants that will build up in their cells over the organism's lifetime. And so one of these chemical contaminants that's very well known is a fat soluble chemical like DDT. So DDT was one of the first pesticides, and it was used in the 1960s everywhere on crops. And what scientists started seeing was that bird populations were decreasing alarmingly quickly. And so what had happened was DDT results in very soft eggshells. So as these birds took the chemical DDT into their bodies just from eating seeds like wheat seeds or something, their reproductive success dropped dramatically. And a woman named Rachel Carson in the 60s wrote a book called Silent Spring about the death of all of these birds. And luckily was taken quite seriously as a scientist. And then slowly DDT was phased out in most countries. So for birds low on the food chain, they would still have problems with DDT consumption. But then also biomagnification can happen. So if you are a very big bird, let's say like a bald eagle or a peregrine falcon, and you eat little birds, then you're getting a little bit of DDT in the little bird bodies. And over time, it's going to increase up the food chain, the concentration of that chemical in the different trophic levels. So you can see here this image. So this is krill have a tiny, tiny amount, and they're taken in by different kinds of fish. This, I assume, is probably a whale of some sort or a seal, and then a polar bear. And this is a common, the amount of contaminant in these different organisms is increasing with the trophic levels. And so PCBs are another chemical fat soluble contaminant in aquatic ecosystems that have very, very high concentrations in orca populations. So that is something that we need to be aware of too when we're using chemicals in our lives to create products as well as agricultural process. And then microplastics, we've heard a lot about. They're generated from the slow breakdown of plastic into tiny pieces of plastic, and they can release or provide surfaces for toxic carbon compounds to be created. And those are then eaten. And this is a zooplankton, which is super, super tiny, even smaller than a krill, which is a little tiny shrimp. And so these are going to be consumed, and as you go up the trophic levels, then you're going to have more and more microplastics in each trophic level because they have been consumed in small amounts over long periods of time. So restoration of these degraded ecosystems. A degradation of an ecosystem is going to result in a loss of biodiversity, possible species extinction, loss of an ecosystem and its services. So ecosystem services might be water filtration, carbon dioxide or carbon sequestration, flood protection, a variety of things that the ecosystem is doing for us that we're not paying for. But if the ecosystem is degraded, they can't function properly. So one way to restore ecosystems is through the process of rewilding, which is to leave ecosystems to recover on their own because they tend to do it more efficiently than with human interference. That said, they might need some human help. And so what that might look like is control of invasive species, distribution of seeds. So in some cases, the trees have all been cut down and they need to have seed provided so that the different species can regrow. Reintroduction of keystone species. So if you were in my class last year, you watched the video, how to wolves change rivers, and wolves in that case were the keystone species. And they were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park that helped that ecosystem restore itself. And then also reconnecting fragmented ecosystems. So if the ecosystems have a highway going through them or have been cut apart, like in a logging event like this, there needs to be some kind of reconnection process that allows organisms to move through this space without being under threat. So an example of this, and this is a picture of the Hindwye, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Hindwye Reserve in New Zealand. And that was an area of agricultural land, about 1,250 hectares of agricultural land. And what they did was they controlled alien mammals. I think there was something about possums, and I can't remember what the alien mammals were in this region. But other than that, they allowed rewilding to occur without disruption by humans, and the regeneration speed was quite surprising to them. So there are situations where if we take initiative to make these things happen, they can happen. They just need the incentivization to make these things happen. So to summarize, ecosystem stability is achieved with consistent energy and nutrients plus high genetic diversity. Humans are affecting ecosystems, as you can see by these goats on this trash pile, through climate change, harvesting of energy and nutrients, and production of pollutants. Bioaccumulation leads to biomagnification, and biomagnification is happening at a trophic level where concentrations of contaminants are increasing. And that's what this picture is of. This is of mercury concentrations at high trophic levels versus medium and then low trophic levels. And addressing the issue may need rewilding with some human intervention. So if you're SL, you can stop here. If you're HL, there are 2 more slides for you to go. So succession is a process of regrowth that happens when damage has been done to an ecosystem. So there's primary and secondary succession. So a primary succession situation is that there is no soil, whereas secondary succession is there is soil. So the primary succession process is going to take a lot longer because lichens and mosses and tiny plants need to regrow the soil before plants can really get going. So succession can occur because of abiotic factors like a volcano, or biotic factors like a beaver dam. So a beaver dam can block off an area and then that whole back area floods. So succession is a sequence of changes that progressively transforms ecosystems, and both species and abiotic factors play a role in this process. So succession is going to go from grasslands to being forests. So if you had secondary succession where a forest fire went through, then you'd have small plants growing, and slowly over time it would become a climax community, but initially it would be a grassland. And these new species are going to start to arrive and grow due to different nutrients, amount of light available, water retention because soil is increasing, temperature changes because of shading from other plants, and then rainfall due to transpiration because there's more and more plants in the area. When the changes stop, then a climax community has been reached for that ecosystem and for that area. And that climax community is going to have stable and persistent populations. So the same organisms are going to live in that area, supporting each other. But if there is human intervention, what that can mean is that there's cyclical or arrested succession. So some succession happens in a cyclical pattern with one ecosystem replacing another. This is not necessarily a human-induced example, but the California fire cycle, for example. So forest fires are very common in that ecosystem. And what would happen is they'd grow into a forest, there'd be a forest fire, it would drop the forest down and it would start growing back again. In the case of New Zealand, these these mussels will come in and settle on barnacles and then eat them. And then once the barnacles are gone, then the mussels move away and then the barnacles come back and then the mussels land on them again. So that's a cyclical process too that has nothing to do with humans. But arrested or deflected succession, these are more or less the same thing, occurs when humans interfere in achieving a climax community. So for example, grazing your goats in a grassland ecosystem is going to prevent it from growing into a forest. Draining wetlands to allow trees to grow and dry condition plants to grow will result in a meadow. So this is an example. These are examples of arrested succession where the succession process has been stopped at a certain point. All right, that's it for this video. Thank you for watching.